Thank you, Karen. I'm really excited to be here. I've met a few of you here at the opening, but my name is Platt Hill. I am the owner of Platt Hill Nursery. We have two locations. One is in Carpentersville on Randall Road. Hopefully some of you are familiar with that. And then the other one is on Lake Street, which is US 20 in Bloomingdale. We've been in business for 34 years, really close to 35, so I'm rounding up a little bit. So in any event, what am I doing here today to talk to you about the history of Dundee? Well, it turns out that I am the great-grandson of a man named David Hill. And to give you a little history on David Hill, he was from Scotland and was very interested in plants. And in the mid-1800s, he was commissioned by an organization which I'm foggy on in England to come over to the new country, the United States of America, and actually North America, to research what plants grew here and find out what plants might go back to England and Scotland and perform well there. And so he was on this mission, and he came to Dundee to meet a man named William Hill, who was actually an orchardist here and was actually growing some evergreens himself. And so as part of this research mission, he had contacted William Hill and was coming to Dundee. So he got to Dundee and was on horseback, and as he came into town, he saw a young lady in a horse and carriage, and the horse had gotten spooked and was running away with his carriage. So being a gentleman, he helped rein in this carriage and save this young lady from what probably would have been an unfortunate and unpleasant ending to this event. So she, being of good breeding, asked him over for lunch in a way of thanking him for this act of gentlemanly courage. And it turns out her name was Margaret Hill, and she was the daughter of William Hill. And so they had a nice lunch together, and this got David Hill to meet William Hill. And so this was all good and fortuitous, and so David Hill was going to spend some time here in Dundee, learning about what William Hill was doing. During that period, he got notification from England that the organization that was funding this research mission had run out of money. So he got a telegram saying, "We're out of money, good luck." That's kind of how things were done in those days. So I often thought I should have sent that to my kids when they were in college. "We run out of money, good luck." So in any event, he decided to stay and throw his hat in with William Hill. I guess he didn't have a whole lot else to do at that time. And so this connection with he and Margaret grew to be a little closer, and they fell in love and got married. And so during this process, he was working with his father-in-law, William Hill, and Hill married a Hill, which is kind of unique. So they had 4 children, 4 sons, one of which was Arthur Hill, who was born in 1881 on the day that President Garfield was shot. And the vice president was Arthur, who then became the president, and that's how my grandfather got his name, Arthur Hill. Yeah. So he took over the business, and actually to go back with David Hill a little bit, during this process of having the family and everything else, his passion was growing evergreens, and his main market was selling evergreens out in the Plain States. At that time in the mid-1800s and even late 1800s and early 1900s, the Plain States were all opening up for agriculture. Well, those of you that are familiar with it, being prairie states, the wind blows out there almost continually. And so for protection for the homesteads, for protection for the crops, protection for livestock, they wanted to have evergreens, which would give them protection from the wind, 12 months of the year. So that was a big, big market. And also being in Chicago with the rail hubs, he was able to ship the product out into the Plain States. Back then there weren't a whole lot of interstate highways built yet. So that was his big market. And his passion was not only growing the plants, but he loved marketing. And I never knew the man personally, but I guess looking at the history and the things I've seen of them. And so the big sign that was in Dundee that maybe many of you remember that said the largest evergreen grower in the world, I think that is like a little snapshot into the personality of David Hill. So in any event, he had the 4 sons. The only son that was really, I guess, interested and involved in the business was my grandfather, Art Hill, who ran the business through World War I and through the Depression and through World War II. So some tough times, but he did a fine job managing the company as well, and actually converted it because the demand for evergreens for windbreak was starting to get filled up. So he converted it and brought in more plant material for ornamental landscaping. And of course, at that same time, Chicago was growing. Suburbia started, so there was a big demand for plants for that. He had three children. He had two daughters and one son, and his son was Jack Hill, who was my father. And my father fought in World War II, and then he came back, and at the end of World War II, he sort of started taking over the reins of D. Hill Nursery. And one of the things that he was just absolutely fascinated with was bonsai. And he had seen some of that when he was in the Orient. He fought in the Pacific Theater, and so he'd seen some of that both in China and Japan, and was just enamored of it. And so he started the Garden Center, which I don't know if many of you remember was on the corner of 31 and 72. One of the big events they had every year was the bonsai show, and they would get people from all across the country to come in and exhibit their bonsai. And that was a lot of fun, and they had this big hoopla with that. And then my father was interested in politics as well, and he was in 1966 elected as a state representative from the 33rd District. He was reelected in 1968. Unfortunately, he perished in an unfortunate accident in 1968. And so those of you that maybe have had any experience in this, I think it's one of the hardest things in life is to have a child predecease you. And so my grandfather, Art Hill, was still alive at the time, but it really, I guess in retrospect, and I was only 18, in looking back at what that did to my grandfather, I mean, it took his heart was out of the business. I mean, it just grieved him so greatly. In any event, so he left his stock, his ownership in D. Hill Nursery to his two daughters, which were my aunts, but hadn't worked in the business, nor had their husbands worked in the business. I came along in 1974, graduated with a MBA from the University of Chicago, and wanted to be a stock market. I wanted to be Bernie Madoff. No, not really. Not really Bernie Madoff, but maybe somebody a little more honest and with integrity. But in any event, that was my thing. Well, 74, those who think back that far, was a real tough year in the stock market, really tough year, and a lot of people don't remember that. But anyway, there were no jobs to be had. I'd go out there with my resume, hat in hand, and I couldn't hardly get an interview. So humbled, I came back to the family and said, look, I don't have anything to do. I've got an MBA, and I've got a strong back and a weak mind, and I can dig a ditch for a living. So they graciously took me in, and one of the good things about it is, I guess being more of an adult now, they allowed me to train in all the different departments of the nursery, in the landscape, the retail, the propagation area, the office, the marketing, and so forth. So I worked for them for 6 years, and at which time we were starting to have a little friction in the boardroom, in the ownership room, which is not unheard of at a family business. And the nut of it is that everybody that owned the company was all in their 60s or older, and they wanted to get the money out of the company, which nothing wrong with that. I mean, they had no vested interest, they had no children in anything else. I was a young person and wanted to build a company, so every time I wanted to buy a new farm or expand the business, buy a new truck, build new greenhouses, they didn't want to do it. And it wasn't a matter of right or wrong, it was a matter of different what they wanted to do. So that was 1980, and so we sat down and had I think a very productive meeting, and I said to them, look, it's your company, you can sell it, do what you want with it, but I'm going to go do my own thing. I didn't even know what that was, but I said, you guys don't want to build a business, I want to be in a business that's growing. They sold D. Hill Nursery, which is now out in Union, Illinois. And I skipped a little bit about the part where Spring Hill came in. Spring Hill came in, when was that? 76, 77? You guys help me out here if I'm getting foggy on my dates. A long time ago, yeah. Basically, I guess the history of that is that when you run a production nursery as opposed to a grain farm you're not removing the topsoil. In a production nursery, you actually are. You're digging the plant, the bulb and burlap, And so if you do that over a 100-year period, you've depleted a lot of the topsoil. And, it's, I guess, not impossible, but I guess it's an economic matter over those times and in those years. You just couldn't replace it. So the farm was pretty well depleted. So they decided to move out in Union, Illinois, which is actually where I worked. And they moved out there in 1969, I think is when they started, and completed the move then when Spring Hill Mall came in. So in any event, that D Hill Nursery is still a viable business out there. It was bought by a man named Bud Harms and his, I think, brother-in-law named Dick Lawner. And Bud Harms' son, David Harms, still runs and operates that and owns it. So in any event, that kind of concludes my little short trip down memory lane. Is